History remembers King Henry VIII as a colossus. We see him in the iconic portraits of Hans Holbein, a man of immense physical presence, the defender of the faith, the king of 6 wives, and the architect of the English Reformation. To his contemporaries, he was the Golden King, the monarch who inherited a kingdom of staggering surplus and turned it into a grand theater of European power. But behind the velvet curtains and the towering marble pillars of Hampton Court, there was a darker narrative, a story written in the red ink of insolvency and the hollow echoes of broken promises. Henry VIII was not just a reformer of the church, he was a predator of the currency. While he was busy reshaping the spiritual world and challenging the Pope, he was secretly hollowing out the material foundations of his realm. This is the story of the Great Debasement, the most sophisticated act of state-sponsored theft in English history. It is a chronicle of how a king, driven by an unquenchable ego and the ruinous cost of war, decided that the easiest way to pay his debts was to steal the very value of the money in his subjects' pockets. He didn't use a sword to rob his people, he used the forge. To understand Henry's crime, we must first understand the scale of his inheritance. Henry VIII came to the throne in 1509 as one of the wealthiest princes in all of Christendom. His father, Henry VII, had been a miser king. He spent his entire reign obsessed with fiscal solvency, avoiding the siren call of costly foreign wars and extracting every possible penny from his nobles through a relentless machine of taxes, bonds, and fines. When the elder Henry died, he left his 18-year-old son a fortune of nearly £1.5 million, a staggering, almost unimaginable sum in the 16th century. It was a treasury that should have secured the English crown for a century. But the young Henry was not a man of ledgers or careful accounting. He was a man of magnificence. To Henry, money was not a resource to be managed, it was fuel for the roaring fire of his ambition. He wanted to be more than a king of a small island. He wanted to be a warrior emperor, a rival to Francis I of France and Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. Within just a few years of his coronation, the father's careful, cold-blooded surplus had been incinerated in the pursuit of European prestige. The Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520 was the ultimate symbol of this fiscal madness. It was a diplomatic summit of such staggering waste that it cost the English treasury an entire year's worth of tax revenue just for 2 weeks of feasting, jousting, and displays of gold-woven tents. Henry was buying the illusion of power, competing in a game of who can spend more. He was treating the wealth of England like an infinite spring, blissfully unaware, or perhaps utterly uncaring, that the floor of his coffers was already beginning to appear. By the mid-1530s, the king was effectively insolvent. For a time, he found a desperate miracle in the dissolution of the monasteries. Between 1536 and 1541, he seized the lands, the silver, and the lead of England's religious houses, selling off the heritage of centuries to the highest bidder. It was the greatest land grab in history, but even the vast, holy wealth of the church was not enough to feed Henry's insatiable war machine. By the early 1540s, the situation reached a terminal breaking point. Henry was aging, bloated, and desperate for one final, glorious military triumph. He launched a massive, reckless two-front war against both Scotland and France simultaneously. War in the 16th century was an economic black hole. It was no longer about a few knights in armor. It was about the new industrial technology of power, gunpowder, massive cannons, complex coastal fortifications, and thousands of professional mercenaries required immediate liquid capital. Traditional taxation was a sluggish beast, too slow and too politically dangerous to rely on. By 1544, the proceeds from the monasteries were gone, vanished into the mud of the siege of Boulogne. Henry stood on the edge of a fiscal abyss. In May 1542, the king issued a clandestine directive. It was so sensitive, so dangerously fraudulent, that it wasn't even shared with the full Privy Council. The order was sent directly to the high-ranking officers of the Tower Mint in London. The plan was simple, brilliant, and utterly devious. Henry ordered the mint to begin hoarding every scrap of silver that came through their doors. He halted the production of standard high-purity coinage and began secretly stockpiling bullion. For 2 long years, the mints sat strangely silent, while the king's agents scoured every corner of the country, stripping the realm of its silver bullion.
In 1544, the trap was finally sprung. Henry announced a grand recoinage. He called in the old high-quality coins and replaced them with brand-new ones bearing his magnificent, full-faced portrait. To the average peasant or market merchant, the new coins looked impressive. They were shiny, heavy, and bore the unmistakable authority of the king. But beneath the surface, a crime was being committed. Before this era, the English pound was a global gold standard for sound money. It was made of sterling silver, a purity of 92.5%. Henry decided to murder that trust. He ordered the mints to systematically reduce the silver content of the coins. In 1544, the silver was dropped to 75%. In 1545, it fell to 50%. By the end of his reign, the silver coins were actually 66% copper. The king was literally diluting the value of his nation's lifeblood. For every 2 ounces of silver he took in from his people, he gave back only 1, filling the gap with worthless base metal. He kept the difference as pure profit.
For a few months, the grand illusion held. But trust is a fragile thing in economics. It can survive a rumor, but it cannot survive the physical reality of the metal. As the coins changed hands, the deception began to reveal itself in the most humiliating way possible. Henry's mints had used a technique called blanching. They took coins that were mostly copper and gave them a microscopic wash of pure silver. But the high points of a coin are the first to wear down through friction. And on the English groat, the highest point was the tip of King Henry's nose. Slowly across the kingdom, the silver rubbed off. The majestic, regal face of the king began to reveal a sickly, reddish glow beneath the surface. The people gave him a new, mocking nickname, Old Copper Nose. It was more than a joke. It was the moment the public realized their sovereign had picked their pockets. The king's face was literally blushing with the shame of his own fraud. As the realization spread, a fundamental law of economics took hold, a principle we now call Gresham's law. It states that bad money drives out good. The people were no fools. They realized the old coins were nearly pure silver, while the new ones were little more than copper scrap. Instantly, the good money vanished. Merchants and citizens began to hoard the old silver, melting it down or smuggling it abroad. But the real tragedy was the loss of purchasing power. This was the invisible thief of inflation. Prices in England began to skyrocket. A quarter of wheat that had cost 6 shillings surged to nearly 20. For the laboring poor, it was a death sentence. Their wages were fixed by law and custom, but the price of bread was not. For the first time in generations, the specter of mass starvation returned to the English countryside, not because of a failed harvest, but because the king had broken the language of value. The disaster did not stop at England's borders. England was part of a global financial system centered in Antwerp, the Wall Street of the 16th century. When the news of the Great Debasement hit the exchanges of Europe, the value of the English pound plummeted. England's credit rating was downgraded to junk status. Henry was now trapped in a debt spiral. The more he debased the currency to pay for the war, the more expensive the war itself became, as foreign suppliers demanded more and more of the worthless coins. He was chasing a horizon moving away at twice the speed. By January 1547, the Colossus was falling. Henry VIII was dying, his body consumed by infection, and his treasury consumed by debt. He had extracted an estimated £1.2 million from the Great Debasement, a fortune built on the stolen savings of his people, and yet the crown was still bankrupt. When he died, the throne passed to his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, but the boy inherited a nightmare. Instead of stopping the debasement, his counselors, the Duke of Somerset and the Duke of Northumberland, decided to continue it. They were addicted to the short-term fix. England was drifting toward total anarchy, its money worthless and its people desperate. It wasn't until 1558, when Elizabeth I ascended the throne, that the bleeding stopped. She understood a truth her father had ignored. Sovereignty is solvency. She knew she could never be a powerful queen as long as her money was a lie. She turned to Sir Thomas Gresham, her financial advisor. His advice was brutal. You must call in every single coin. You must purge the copper. You must restore the purity, or the kingdom will fall. In 1560, Elizabeth issued a royal proclamation. All the debased, reddish, copper-nosed coins were recalled to the mints. She hired German experts, the world's leading metallurgists, to oversee the refining process. They separated the copper from the silver in a massive, toxic operation. Out of the filth of her father's fraud, Elizabeth forged a new currency. She restored the purity of the pound to the old sterling standard, 92.5% silver. Trust returned. The Great Debasement remains a haunting lesson in the history of finance. It is a reminder that even the most powerful monarchs are subject to the laws of mathematics. Henry VIII thought he was the master of his money. He thought that by putting his face on a coin, he gave it value. He was wrong. Value is not created by a king's decree. It is created by the trust of the people. When Henry murdered that trust, he nearly murdered his kingdom. Today, we live in the era of fiat currency, money that has value only because the government says it does. We live in a world of central banks and digital printing presses. We laugh at Henry's copper nose, but are we doing the same thing today? When we see our life savings losing purchasing power, are we not witnessing a modern-day debasement? The tools have changed, but the price remains the same. I'm Gavin, and this is Medieval Echoes. Subscribe to break the cycle, because history doesn't just repeat, it rhymes. If you know the pattern, you own the future.